So, hello, welcome everybody, and thanks Gabriel for organizing this session, and also really thanks to Kate and Ieva to be here this evening. I'm very glad to have the opportunity to share this session together with you. So, during this session, I will give a presentation about on-air, on-site, which is also part indeed of my broader research as a sound artist and radio maker and PhD researcher. It is a project that has been slowly growing and evolving for many years. At its core, it reflects my belief in radio as an art form in itself, as a socio-political medium, and as a public space for community building and artistic engagement. On-air, on-site is a sound investigation of a temporary radio event consisting of a broadcast schedule of 48 hours of non-stop streaming, which is including live performances, fixed media, and radio artworks that are specifically composed for the festival by an international community of sound artists. The project specifically explores the boundaries of being simultaneously on air on a virtual and physical space, challenging different radio formats. This year marked the third edition of the project, which has evolved into a 2-day festival format. It took place just 2 weeks ago, from the 23rd to the 25th of May, and it runs indeed in parallel with my ongoing doctoral research project, now in its third year. So, the process of developing and implementing on-air on-site has been fundamental in addressing some of my initial research questions, while at the same time is opening up new questions of investigation, reshaping them, and also expanding the scope of my investigation. And it reflects indeed my research on socially engaged radio art practice. The decision to create and organize on-air on-site, however, has deeper roots. It is the result of several years of artistic practice as a radio maker and as a social-politically engaged sound artist. This because my close involvement with independent, non-profit, alternative, experimental, and autonomous community radio projects. So this strongly shaped my approach and this initiative. So after years of working within these networks, I felt, let's say, a strong need to develop a community radio project which is based here in The Hague, and particularly also in connection with the Sonology Institute. The aim is to create a platform, or rather a space, a place that could give voice and space to this vibrant community while also connecting with other realities that I've been part of. So from this need, also Bug Radio was born, which is a community radio initiative which is currently in development. On-air on-site originally emerged as a launching event for Bug Radio, but over the time it has grown into a significant and recurring project in its own right, which is now somehow recognized in a way that can be comparable to the projects like Radiophrenia in Glasgow, which I will say something more about Radiophrenia later on during this presentation. So we have now reached indeed the third edition of the project, bringing together several radio stations, so creating, let's say, a strong networking, and also contemporary and experimental musicians. While I was initially, let's say, uncertain about the result of the project, the process of creating and organizing the festival has proven to be a field for critical reflection in itself. To take two of on-air on-site.
Carol is jamming into my, like perfectly rehearsed and curated set, and he's like starting to turn knobs and push buttons, etc.
So yes, this short video that we just watched is a short recap of the second day of the live events, which took place indeed just last weekend right here at Best in the auditorium. And let's say yes, the project is still evolving, is still in progress, and it's part of a living research progress and process also in itself. So some of the questions remain open. And I can start saying that I'm investigating what can radio be today. In a broader sense, how can it embody a socio-political voice and give space to critical listening in a saturated and fragmented media landscape network? So these are a couple of questions of the investigation. But going a bit more into detail, into the areas of investigation, to explore these questions, the research project develops within three main areas, which correspond to three different perspectives through which I observe, I experiment with, and I analyze the radio as a medium, as an art form, and as a space, as a public space. These areas correspond to three macro categories of the research progress, and each of them is unfolding into more specific micro level of question. So these areas, as of course interconnected, they often overlap, and at the core of all of them, or rather let's say as the main focus running through all of three of them, lies the socio-political impact, or rather the socio-political role that radio plays in the contemporary context. This area, the first of these areas of investigation is radio as a compositional tool, in which I'm exploring the compositional development of my own artistic practice. Then I see also the fact that I'm exploring radio as a medium in itself, in which I'm exploring the technological and philosophical development approach of this area. And the third one is the area in which I see radio as a social and public space for artistic engagement, and it's connected with its social implementation. So, going a bit more into detail, but very briefly I want to mention something about indeed radio as a compositional tool. In this context, radio is understood as a sonic language and as a writing instrument, so as a compositional tool in itself. Here I explore compositional practices that use radio not merely as a medium for transmission, but as a generative environment for creating sound and performative works. So here, for example, I'm wondering how to compose with and within the medium. What compositional structures emerge within radio's temporal and spatial dimension? So my research is also an attempt to create and articulate what I define as specific radio poetics in the context of experimental radio art. And specifically here, I'm investigating the disembodied and acousmatic voice in the radiophonic context. Then I'm wondering how to shape compositional choices according to the radio medium specificities, to the paradigms and the limits of the medium. So which are the characteristics of a composition that is specifically conceived for the radio medium? So for example, instead of a composition that is addressed to a concert context situation. And here one of the primary artistic purpose of the research is to investigate potential and alternative uses of the medium, rather like an experimental medium in itself. And indeed also trying to give a definition of what is a radio artwork, at least within my artistic practice. Then moving through the second categories of question of investigation, in which I envision, I'm investigating radio as a medium. I'm analyzing and exploring radio as a technology, as an interface and as a platform. The aim here is to understand how the medium evolves and influences or expand artistic practices. So what possibilities does experimental radio technology offer today? What is the relationship between radio and network, radio and architecture and spaces, and radio and experimental artistic practices? So which are the difference also between FM radios, web radios, or web streaming platform? Because I can argue that all of them have a different audience and different way of listening. So even when I'm approaching the compositional approach in these three different areas, there are different paradigms to keep in mind and to reconsider. So indeed, again, how is the intersection of new media technologies redefining radio art? So this is related indeed to these categories. And now moving to the last category, let's say, in which I see radio as a public and social space for artistic engagement. Here I see radio as a meeting space and as a meeting place. As an acoustic agora, as I defined, where participatory processes are activated and social, artistic, and political relationships are set in motion. So here there are different considerations, and I'm wondering indeed what kinds of communities are activated through radio. How can radio serve as a space for activism, or also as to foster artistic practices? So this cluster of research questions led me to the development of On Air On Site. So let's say the aim is to foster the development of a community radio, and I would like also to emphasize how it's important in my artistic vision, the hybrid nature of the project. Also existing both in the digital space and in a physical space, so on-site, in situ. It is essential in my artistic vision also this interplay between the virtual and physical. It is at the core of my practice as it allows the community to not only connect online, of course, to the web radios, but also indeed coming together in real life, fostering a deeper engagement and long-term growth of the community. So, thanks to On Air On Site, we are building up a strong networking of different community radio and radio projects, a bit all over Europe and not only. So through the project we are building indeed this networking, and On Air On Site has become a platform for networking across different realities. A particularly important collaboration that I want to mention indeed has been with Radio Frenia in Glasgow. That is a well-established international festival that has become a key institution, let's say, in the field. This year I also had the opportunity to travel to Glasgow and to be part of the festival, let's say for 4 days of the festival. And this allowed, let's say, for a much deeper exchange with them. And our relationship has grown into a strong and mutual collaboration. So Radio Frenia has contributed some of their work to our festival, and in return also bought some of my artwork, and some of my colleagues, Rioni Rossler, were broadcast during the 2 weeks of program. And a part of Radio Frenia, we are also having a strong partnership with Kashmir Radio in Berlin, which is also rebroadcasting some of the festival, with Radio Tonka, which is a well-known community radio based here in The Hague. And then this year we also have a strong collaboration with Radio Tsunami, which is an experimental community radio in Valparaiso in Chile, and Museo del Sonido, which is a quite well-known museum for sound art based in Santiago, which broadcasted and hosted the whole 48 hours of the festival in a listening lounge room. So this is to show indeed how, thanks to the project, indeed we are building up this networking of several community radios. So also, as talking about collaborators and networking, it is important also to highlight how the organizational process of On Air On Site has opened doors to professional fields I hadn't initially planned to explore, I have to be honest. So behind the artistic vision, the project has required a curatorial approach, coordination, communication, social media interaction, software development, and many other multifaceted roles that one takes when organizing, let's say, an art festival. So in that sense, while also understanding the importance of finding the right partners and collaborators, one of the most essential part of the festival was indeed also to find collaborators that could help indeed to develop the project. So we are not building a network, let's say, through the project, but also within it. And of course also, yes, so this is a growing community both inside the organizational aspect of the project, but also within it, as I mentioned. So now I would like to say something briefly about the structure of the festival, let's say, of the project. So the live event component is a fundamental part in the festival structure. On every site runs for 48 hours in total, and the entire festival is webcasted through our online web radio station. In addition, indeed, parts of the program are rebroadcast on FM through our radio stations partnership, including the Nacht FM, and again, like Kashmir Radio in Berlin. So the heart of the festival, however, lies in the live event. And this year also we have successfully, let's say, hosted 3 live performances here in the auditorium, a sound installation, and a panel talk, which is a key moment also for us and it's part of the festival. And the topic of this year's panel was building community through radio, independent, experimental, and alternative models. And I think the part of the panel talk is reflecting our ongoing commitment to participatory practices and also, meaningful exchange through sound and live events. So I think I just wanted to emphasize how it's important to me to have this live part of the project, which is always going on during the 3 edition of the festival. So here is just, I wanted to show like an image which I took from our radio server, just to show also some of the aim that we have reached thanks to this edition of the festival. We had about 5,000 listeners only on our web radio, which I think is, yes, I can say it is a great result for us that is showing and reflecting the increase also of listeners that we are building up thanks to the community. And also we estimated also, yes, about 100 visitors in live, in situ. And this balance between digital reach and physical presence continue to define the hybrid identity of our project and reflects also its evolution. Something else about, also more thinking about the broader aspect of the research project, I explore how in the contemporary era, web radio repropose a spirit that to me is similar to that of the pirate radio movements. This thanks to the economic and technological accessibility, because web radio somehow democratized the production and distribution of some content, allowing also for a decentralization of information and direct control by local, independent, alternative communities. So web radios make the medium more horizontal and led to a decentralization of major mainstream radio station channels to those that are self-managed. So far from being just a technical platform, they embodied a socio-political value, again, configuring themselves as a tool for counter-narrative participation. So in an era where digital technologies are redefining the models of production and distribution, I'm wondering here how radio can be a means of cultural resistance, somehow, of self-representation and community building. So by analyzing how web radios and community radios challenge dominant narratives, I propose here a reflection on their role in reformulating the sound space as a shared and politically significant territory. Sorry, there was another slide. So, another key theme in my research is the understanding of radio as a space for artistic expression of political ideas. So in the current highly sensitive geopolitical moment, this year's edition became particularly powerful in its socio-political resonance. We received several works explicitly dealing with political thematics, reaffirming the capacity of experimental radio to serve as a space for political voice and artistic resistance. We opened the festival, the live part of the festival, with a listening session of a work by Meira Escher, a sound artist living between Israel and Palestine, addressing the Palestinian crisis. We also featured other works by, for example, Sebastian Profundo, an Argentinian artist whose piece reflects on the legacy of fascism, and a piece by Ra, an Italian sound artist, exploring a wide range of contemporary political concerns. So through these works and the broader collective participation, I believe that On Air On Site has demonstrated how radio can become a vital artistic space for addressing urgent political themes. These represent a fundamental socio-political impact of the project and confirms how the medium of radio continues to evolve as a resonant and critical space in both the artistic and the political domains. So, Cistern is the third part of the trilogy The Catastrophe by Escher and Zak, so by Meira Escher and Iran Sachs. She sent us two pieces, two art-ready artworks of 30 minutes each, that are produced and composed based on the poem Sister by poet Tal Nitzan. The catastrophe, al-Nakba, is a term that is used specifically to refer to the deconstruction and occupation of Palestine and the displacement of the majority of Palestinians by the Israeli state. So the word and the fact and the act of Nakba resonates from the 1948 to the present days. And it's also expand its reach to, in fact, present day in the current geopolitical moment that we know we are living, let's say. So Sister is a musical setting of a poem, and the poem is inspired by Massimo Berruti photograph, and is a portrait of two little children carrying a water tank in the ruins of a bombarded building in Beit Khan in Gaza, on their way to a water distribution point, shortly destroyed after an Israeli attack in 2014. So we open the live part of the festival with this piece, and I would like to listen with you an excerpt of this piece.
בורות. ידינו לא שפכו את המים, ידינו לא פוצצו את הבריכות, ידינו לא נקבו את הצינורות, לא ניצצו את המאגרים, את מתקני הטיהור, לא רוקנו את הבורות. ולמראה הילדה היורדת במדרגות הרפאים היתומות מבית שלא אנחנו החרבנו, אוחזת אח קטן ביד אחת, מיכל פלסטיק ריק באחרת, למלאו בנקודת החלוקה $4 לקוב. גרוננו לא ניחר, בצמא בוער מכל צמא.
לא.
And to remember how radio was born. I mean, we all know that radio was born as a tool of propaganda and control with the military industry, and particularly powerful during the Second World War, and then evolved as a space for cultural exchange, communication, music distribution, and information. So I think, and I'm exploring how the project, let's say, is somehow mirroring this evolution in the contemporary context, and how radio can be still meaningful in this context, but of course with a completely different approach if we think about web radios. So yes, this piece, I think we wanted really to give some highlights to this piece by Meira Escher, because we thought, yeah, it was very meaningful for us to open the live part of the festival with this strong piece and listening session. Now, going back to the structure of the festival, this year we had more than 100 artists who participated in the event. And okay, of course, this is just like a screenshot about how our web radios, let's say more than the web radios, I also define it as an online sonic platform, because the website of On Air On Site, it's also serve as a live archive. And I think also a key aspect of web radio is their archival potential, which makes a huge difference, of course, with FM radio, because while FM radio broadcasts are tied to the irrepeatable and live moment, web radios offer the possibility to store and preserve the content and the sound experiments also. So this characteristic not only subverts the transience of traditional radio, but also allows for the construction of an accessible and dynamic sound heritage, useful for collective memory and also for non-linear listening. So through digital means, web radios open up new paths for exploring radio as a living archive, where history and experimentation can coexist. So the ability to archive allows for the valorization of marginalized voices and create a space for non-dominant sound tradition. And the digital archive becomes also a tool for long-term resistance, I would say, and cultural representation. So artistic radio in web radios find a space to be, in this way, also preserved, studied, and reinterpreted. So the ability to archive experimental sound broaden the dialogue between past and future, keeping alive the tension between tradition and innovation. So I think this is also very, one of the key aspects also of what we are doing with our own site, because indeed it's not just the live moment, the live event, but it's possible also to re-listen to the whole festival, let's say, to the whole part of the festival, both the fixed media and the live part of the festival going to the website. So integrating the archival aspect, I think that further strengthens the value of web radios, at least in my artistic vision, in my artistic view, showing how they can exceed the technical and temporal limits of, let's say, more traditional radio, to embrace a more inclusive and horizontal model of making radio nowadays. So here I just want to show some, let's say, yes, some pictures from the archive. These are from the last year's edition. Here we were at the Institute of Sonology. And what I like also to emphasize is that the goal of building up a community radio is really being affecting in its way, because we have artists that are joining us a bit from all over Europe that are joining us now every year. So I think this is quite also important for the development of the project. And now, also going through the end of the presentation, I would like to say something about bug radio, which I mentioned at the beginning of my talk. So bug radio was launched during the last year
edition of On Air On Site, and from November 2024, we are airing regular shows from a variety of different radio makers and also hosting live events. And what I wanted to say is that specifically about bug radio is that, of course, it's also driven by a strong belief in radio as a public space, again, and it's indeed the development of On Air On Site on a more local environment, I would say, because it's strictly connected with the reality of The Hague. And On Air On Site is not indeed a separate initiative, but is the official project that was conceived originally for launching Bug Radio. A project that now is developing in parallel, and it's also in full synergy with it. This because the two are strictly connected, intrinsically linked, I would say, and are mutually reinforcing each other. Because On Air On Site is increasing also the participation of Bug Radio, and has proven also to be consistent, let's say, in its intent, because some of the artists who were originally involved into the On Air On Site are now also participating in Bug Radio and vice versa. So this is somehow showing, in my view, at least how the two projects are continuing to feed and enrich each other. So I think with the project, what I'm trying to do is to demonstrate how artistic practice can evolve through community-based experimentation. And it shows how the process and the outcomes in research are deeply interconnected. So as I said at the beginning, the development of On Air On Site is helping me in addressing many of my questions of investigation, and it's opening up and reshaping some of the original questions of the research project. So yes, I think this is the last part of the presentation. So yeah, thank you all for your attention. I hope that the presentation has offered a bit more clear and comprehensive overview of the project and of On Air On Site specifically. And yes, I look forward to any thoughts or comments after the session. And now I will give the floor to Kate Donovan, who will give a presentation.
You'll notice that I'm doing my presentation through the radios. Tonight I'm going to share with you a motif, followed by two radio examples. I'll also mention that the radios can have a bit of a life of their own, so if ever you need to, or feel the need to turn a radio down or off, then please go ahead. So this presentation is called A Stone, a Story and a Sediment. In such a gathering of ideas, things will necessarily be left out. And I say that as a reminder to you and me both that in many ways it is also incomplete. Number one, a stone. This is a lodestone. I'm going to pass it around now. Then you can feel the weight of the stone, notice its textures. It's quite an unassuming stone, but this is a stone that responds to the Earth's signals. If we open up the idea of what radio is to include natural as well as technological electromagnetism, we could say that the Earth transmits radio waves and that this stone receives them. The lodestone has been used by compass by humans for millennia. It contains magnetite, a naturally magnetic mineral, but it's a mixture of magnetite with other materials that makes it a permanent magnet, the only kind found in nature. So the lodestone is a non-homogeneous gathering, a conglomerate body of differing matter. Permanent magnets attract metals, they receive them, but they can also transmit their magnetism to others. In this way, they embody a push and pull, a transmission and reception, or a transception. In order to become a permanent magnet, a lodestone must first be activated by electromagnetism. This happens by the intense impact of a lightning strike. Lightning is another example of natural radio. And so we could say that the lodestone is an embodiment of a meeting of the geologically multiple with the atmospherically charged. It's a conglomerate body of difference activated by radio. This, together with its ability to transceive, makes it a figure or motif for the following examples. Two, a story. Margherita Brillada is an artist and activist who comes from a background in theatre. She turned to radio for its emancipatory potential, not least because it allows for public participation without being seen. In 1987, she initiated the project Women's Skia Radio. Skia means gossip, stories, or perhaps even oral histories in Irish. The project was later named Radio Pirate Women, and it ran intermittently from 1989 until around 2011, using a low-powered transmitter from Darcy's kitchen in a working-class area in Galway. So here is an undoing of the traditional radio studio and a positioning of the domestic space as generative, one that fosters community and conviviality in the kitchen. It's also a kind of trickstery, a flipping of sorts, because the private becomes public, yet remains outside of the cultural expectations of the gaze. The project was playful and centered around storytelling, oral histories, and exchange. Unlike many polished radio practices, process was treasured more than outcome. And the scale of the project was also important. The transmitter covered a 2-mile radius, narrowcasting rather than broadcasting. Darcy's story is a lesser-known one of the micro-FM movement, which is usually accredited to Tetsuo Kogawa. Kogawa said, "Micro means diverse, multiple, polymorphous." And on the political aspect of this movement, he said, "Change in a tiny space could resonate to larger space, but without microscopic change, no radical change would be possible." Radio Pirate Women was a feminist and activist project with a deeply political agenda. The main premise was to gather women from diverse walks of life, positionalities, and worldviews, with the rule that women should speak freely and uninterrupted on the air. At that time, freedom of speech as an EU law was undermined by local broadcast regulations in Ireland. Censorship was applied to sensitive social, political, and religious issues of the time. Darcy's project revealed and troubled national boundaries by promoting free speech, regardless of geographic location. call to allow women to speak uninterrupted centered a practice of listening to each other, even if you may not agree. And here we see transceiving as practice, transmitting the practice of listening, the promotion of listening across difference. Like the lodestone, we could say that this project was a gathering of difference activated by radio. Three, a sediment. Rummelsburg Bay is an area in central Berlin that quite literally holds the sediments of its past. From around 1850 until the end of the last century, it was a hive of various industrial activity. It's an area that is now being drastically gentrified. The land-based surroundings as well as on the water. The diversity of vessels in this area is impressive, from self-made boats to artist studios to speedboats and, recently, more and more commercial endeavors. Last September, Radio Otherwise initiated a durational work in the Bay. Radio Otherwise is an artistic research project initiated by myself and Monai de Paula Antunes, later joined by Nico de Paula Lefort and Martin Prince, in which we bring together listening and ecological thinking in relation to radio practice. This was one of a number of projects in which we focused on infrastructures of flow in terms of water and electromagnetism in urban environments, asking, how does it move? How is it interrupted or propagated? Who has access? Where is the governmental control? Where are moments and spaces of deviation? Where are aspects of monetization, and where might we see parallels in the squeezing in of commercial use? The insular floating platform was initiated in response to the diminishing spaces for independent, artistic and creative projects in Berlin. To quote them, they say, the insula is an approach in the opposite direction, a shift from land to water to re-establish cultural activities within the city's boundaries. It's a free space in Berlin for art, music and performances at the center of Rummelsburg Bay. With Radio Otherwise, we set up a temporary outdoor studio on the floating platform. It was streamed online and partly transmitted on FM in Berlin and Potsdam, as well as picked up at the Swiss Architecture Museum in Basel and played within their exhibition space. In the same way that Darcy's project brought together a diversity of voices and the sharing of listening through radio, we used a variety of devices to tune into a plurality of sounds and signals. Underwater, airborne, vibrational, low and high frequencies of electromagnetism. Each revealed a different aspect of the site and the moment. The inputs were varied and adapted over the 5-hour transmission, but I'll share 2 examples. Hydrophones. They revealed how the waters were dominated by human activity. Mostly what we heard were motorboats near and far, or sometimes human paddlers. The lack of sound from fish and plant life was striking and a sign of the site's history of pollution. Through walkie-talkies, we could hear the sound of construction workers nearby, revealing the gentrification of the area in real time. The layers of listening revealed social, political, technological, and more than human entanglements in the area that always integrated ecologies of environment and infrastructure. And I'll finish with another note on listening. As both of these examples show, listening is not always comfortable. In the case of Darcy's project, listening can mean confronting social, ethical, political differences. In the case of the Radio Otherwise project, listening can mean coming to terms with histories of extraction, production, pollution, as well as an anthropocentric present that favours commercialisation. But both projects use listening and radio making as ways to notice, to connect, to share, and to sit with potentially uncomfortable relationalities of an inherited present. Radio is used to bring difference and multiplicity into relation. Both projects return to the motif of the lodestone in their methods of transceiving and as conglomerate bodies of difference activated by radio. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. Yeah? Can you hear me okay? Yeah, after these wonderful presentations, I'm slightly tempted to just skip to questions altogether because I feel like I have more of them. Yeah, thank you very much for having me here. It's really a pleasure and honor to share the stage with you both. My name is Ieva. As briefly was mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Oslo. And my project altogether is looking at how community radio and broader independent sound media, mostly coming from Kyiv, but in general in Ukraine, is using these formats to make sense out of civilian life through an ongoing war, so sort of since the full-scale invasion. So again, already in the presentations, there were things that I sort of was picking up about, and I'm really looking forward to our question session afterwards. But before that, I want to talk a little bit about a radio festival that I organized together with colleagues in Berlin last October. So one part of my thesis and my work is also looking at how these community radios in Ukraine started working or continued working with their partners, mostly Central and Eastern Europe, as a way of thinking of the translocal dimension of radio and ways of bringing certain imaginations and sounds and experiences of war closer to audiences in Europe. And this was the bit where my academic, let's say, work and my more practitioner side really kind of met together. And that really sort of manifested mostly in this festival that's called Signals to Noise that I will be talking about today. But just before that, I want to sort of maybe provoke or tease a little bit with these questions that obviously I'm not going to answer in my presentation, but maybe as we go on to the discussion we can think about, is in these examples of radios creating different kind of networks and coming together through different sharings of sonic imagination or imagination of space and being together. Can we think about them as forms of new geopoetics or new geo-radio poetics or radiophonics? I was thinking about these other words that could come here. So as a way of listening together through the uncomfort and across the differences, but also across the commonalities and imagining new geopolitical arrangements potentially. I'm particularly interested in the notions of East and West. Or, and this is my practitioner side asking, and again, maybe provoking a little bit, is the emergence of networks, radio festivals, and other kind of project economy-based formations around radio practice is a response to the lack of more infrastructural opportunities for radio stations to develop into long-term institutions, exist for a long time, have a sort of lineage continuation from other practices. We have talked about micro-radio, pirate radio today, and that memory seems to be always having to be reinvented by the new practitioners of experimental radio. So this provocation aside, I want to talk about Signals to Noise as a place and sort of time where we were trying to play around with some of these thoughts. So if you scan the QR code, you will go to the website of the festival that was organized in Kashmir Radio. Kashmir Radio in Berlin was our kind of host. The event happened, for those of you who know Berlin, in Silent Green in Kulturquartier in Wedding neighborhood, the same neighborhood Kashmir Radio is based in. And it, in the final sort of state of it, was a collaboration between 14 radios. And one particular moment that I want to highlight is that the festival was co-curated. So I had the pleasure, the honor to be one of the sort of curatorial team together with my colleagues Matteo Spano, Natalie Grobner, Lucia Udvardiova, and then a larger team of Kashmir people and people who we invited from abroad. But in fact, the process to make the festival was divided into two bits. First phase was the workshopping series, and the second phase was the event. So I will kind of list all the radios that you see there on the far end of the screen. From the top left is Dublin Digital Radio from Dublin, 20 Feet Radio from Kyiv. Independent Community Radio Network is a network of radios, kind of mostly Baltic and sort of Scandinavia, so Oslo, Radio Rakel, Seyðisfjörður Radio from Iceland, Lake Radio from Copenhagen, Ida Radio that you also see just below from Tallinn and Helsinki. They have two radio stations there. Then we had Turkultura from Riga, Hazolin Radios, this sort of like a gasoline spill logo from Kyiv, Kanal 103 from Skopje, North Macedonia, Lamajun from Budapest, Hungary, Radio Punctum from Prague, Lake from Copenhagen, Orange from Vienna, Radio Plato from Minsk/Vilnius, so this is like a diasporic radio made from community who have to flee Belarus after the protests. Black Rhino Radio from Bucharest, Radio Kaplan from Warsaw, Radio Student from Ljubljana, and Radio Aparat from Belgrade there in the bottom. So the first part, the workshopping phase, we invited 4 radios to come to Berlin for a week. So it was 3 weeks, one in April, May, and June, 4 different radios each time, to spend a week together, sort of sharing their experiences, their studio work, their topics that are important to them, their radio programming, etc., all the different things, and kind of start working together on what we called units. So for the festival, each radio was invited to make 1 to 3 units, and what we named them units to be as big as possible, because that eventually meant that we had a radiophonic circus performance, installations, music sets, discussions, workshops, live events, film screenings, etc. We also invited other partners. Margherita came and visited us in April, so she also got a sense of the first phase of working together. And one of the reasons or also outcomes was to really show the diversity of what people understand or sort of what kind of radio making really happens in these studios. So they're invited to make something that represents their locales and what their radio would sound like and present that to audience in Berlin. Of course, I mean, people chose something that they thought is more unique and more exceptional, and perhaps, it doesn't really reflect necessarily the mundane side of radio and daily broadcasting. But nevertheless, that kind of sharing of what the program is looking like, and again, if you scan the QR code, you can see all the program units there, was really a sort of organic or, semi-organic, semi-curated way to also show the diversity of topics that people cared about. So a lot of different political topics or different sort of social realities came across, from gentrification to media laws to global events, etc., etc. And I say the case of Signals to Noise with this kind of like an Eastern Days Independent Community Radio Network, because Signals to Noise is a festival, and the goal really was to bring radios together for them to carry on and then further collaborate and make something else, and just kind of bring people together so they would know that they exist and maybe share questions. But actually, it itself was a continuation of a festival organized by Project Eastern Days. There's a platform that is focusing on highlighting lesser-known, mostly electronic, but in general, alternative sound from Central and Eastern Europe. And as I already mentioned, the Independent Community Radio Network is this network between the radios that also try to help each other in various project writings, but also visit each other, from very technical questions to very kind of political and, almost to the level of lobbying of what kind of legal status should the radio have in let's say, within the municipal boundaries or within the European boundaries, etc. So instead of explaining a joke, I will just show a small snippet. And this is a unit, actually Black Rhino Radio from Bucharest, that was their unit, was to create a very short snippet, a three-minute short film about the festival, so for you to just get a little bit of an impression. Thank you.
I'm Giacomo, I'm one of the founders of Kashmir Radio. Now I'm how do we call them, a distinguished member. Signal to Noise is a project that I think is very coherent. I think it represents pretty well what the spectrum of values of community radios is or can be. It's not random that this radio come together and work with all the artists, especially exactly starting the process a bit later, right? And to see how chilled or happy to adapt. No, it was really amazing, and it is being very beautiful. This meeting people for the first time, and immediately, we get each other. We kind of have the same lifestyle, the same attitude, more than lifestyle. And it's this community radio lifestyle. That is a word that I actually hated before today. I always was like, yeah, community radio doesn't mean nothing because the spectrum is too wide, But actually, it means a lot.
We do this sound installation. Look out, okay? Our installation is very intimate, but it's very much of the world that comes in. And this is radio, I think.
So yeah, maybe I can leave some of the logos just there. One of the things that strikes me also in the way Giacomo speaks here, but also in the way we all talk about radio, is a certain vagueness that I think is, well, my question is whether that is a strategic vagueness in the way we define something that we say a community. As academics, we try to find words to define that. I think with the festival, and especially this little clip and some of the impressions, I think it's very important not to forget that a lot of the times, especially with community radios, the motivation is fun, for example, which is again one of those vague sort of solidarity implying, but at the same time almost intentionally not too descriptive unifiers that allow a certain collectivity to emerge. And so to come back to the to the Venn diagram that Margherita showed about radio as a compositional tool, radio as a media so our festival, by the way, was also broadcast. It was a 24-hour broadcast on Kashmir radio stream, but also all participating radios were broadcasting bits and pieces of it depending what fit their schedule. So again, that was quite an interesting sort of next level of curatorial decision from their side. And finally, as a social space where people can meet. And the festival, of course, worked. One of the interesting moments for me was that because all of the radios, we centered in sort of Eastern Europe, let's say Central Eastern Europe. A lot of the radio communities had their local sort of diasporas come and join their friends who came there because Berlin is one of those cities that is a meeting point between certain Easternness and Westerness perhaps of Europe. And I mean, that was the symbolic line for us as well. And to have that kind of, multilingual, to some extent diverse, to some extent also unified community, there was very interesting, I think, and it itself served as a sort of social geo-imagination, let's put it this way. So just kind of to put those questions at the end as we maybe move to discussion shortly. I do want to ask these questions openly. What is behind the anonymity and vagueness? And, we tend to play with a lot of definitions, experimental, free radio. I mean, they all have their histories and they all have their meanings, and there are choices that we make when we use those words. But at the same time, I think there is almost a certain, in the tension between the public and the private, for example, that Kate brought up, there is a certain desire not to be defined, of course, but also to remain somewhat anonymous and remain, even the fact that it's, entirely all sonic media, maybe not to be recognized or not to become too popular, not to become too out there. So what is behind that kind of, I think, strategic vagueness in the radio practices that we try to describe? And then kind of coming back to this more practical question, which again becomes complicated and nothing is, I guess, we definitely here don't separate practice from philosophy or from thinking. Can it be and is it a strategy against precarity and for new ways of making sense together? So this making sense is something that I am particularly interested but I know that Margherita and Kate are too, so maybe I'll invite you to the stage and then we can move on to the discussion. Thank you very much.
Okay. Yes.
Yeah.
So first of all, I want to say thanks both of you really for the beautiful, amazing presentation. Maybe just to link with what I just saw on your presentation, it really, how to say, resonates to me. Okay, maybe first just like a simple comment. I was surprised to see how many familiar faces I saw in the, yes, of course, in the videos, that's true. Like people that have participated, that I met in the different community radios project or that they also participated at On Air On Site. So this immediately demonstrates how indeed there is like a vibrant networking connected together. And also trying to, I don't know, to answer, or let's say maybe just a comment also to the first question, like how can we respond to the vagueness of some of the terms, no, that we try to envisage while talking about community radio. So this is something that I'm really also trying to understand. And I was also asked like several times, like, but what is a community? What it means to build up like a community? And somehow it's something that I'm developing while, I'm finding out while developing the project, because I can see like indeed how probably people with like some common interests or common practices are reunited together. But yeah, I can definitely say that it's like quite challenging to try to give a definition of what is a community, or maybe which are the communities that are connected together through radios.
Yeah, because there's also these two ways, right? Like one is that the idea that there is a community that makes a radio, and the other way is that there's a radio that kind of creates community by sort of being, you know, inviting certain kind of interests. I don't know. But for me, like, more interesting questions like, why do we want to think, like, what is in the community that we really kind of are trying to, sometimes I think also to just hold on to and defend, what is that in that word critically that we feel like fits to the radio practices that we do? I don't know, Kate, how do you use community radio in your practice as a term?
Yes and no. But I mean, in terms of definitions, I am always in favor of slippery definitions. I mean, for my work, actually, the definition of radio is what I question. And I came to the conclusion that it's more interesting if it is diverse and it can have different meanings in different contexts. So I would say it's the same for the term community radio. I mean, you could also think about community as being non-human, you know, if you're thinking this bigger picture of a site. Community isn't always just humans.
Also, for example, at least it's also quite difficult to define what is a web radio nowadays, because if you have a look, I think, at the website of all the community radio that you just mentioned also, I mean, that were part of the Signal to Noise, or also the community radios the web radios that were creating networking on our own site. I mean, they all looks different, they all have different approach. So even there, I think there is like not well defined.
Well, we were talking about how for us who are kind of doing radio, for us radio is often a studio or kind of being behind the decks. And someone's like, but you know, for a lot of people, radio is a website. That's just a website. They never think that there is like a room behind it, you know? They just like play a button. Or even not even a website, right? It can be something like a SoundCloud or I mean like one of those like Radio Garden, whatever interfaces people use, and that opens then all other sort of ontology, I guess, of web radio. But I mean, for me that's why like the chat option is always very interesting. How do people kind of create their own social codes around chatting to the radio host if there's a live radio? And I was even thinking about, for example, your presentation, that so much of the way we also present these festivals is coded in this kind of 2000, you know, like internet hacking culture aesthetics, which I think is again like something that, what is the web that we are trying to maybe aesthetically kind of refer to? It's almost like this kind of still slightly even maybe utopian part of digital imagination. I don't know.
I have a question for you that I had to hold back from asking straight after your presentation. It's about the archive. I find that very interesting in relation to this kind of ephemeral media. I mean, there are a few things to say about it. First, I'm always interested in the things that fall out of kind of being caught in archives. And I mean, I can also at the same time understand the need to archive a different way and more diverse practices than the dominant ones that are archived. But I was wondering about you must have had a conversation with the Radiophrenia team about it, and I was wondering if you could say something about that, because I know that they have their live program and they say nothing is going to be available to re-listen afterwards. And you've kind of done the opposite, so I wondered if you could say something about that.
Yes, thanks, Kate. Yes, indeed. I was indeed, when you just started to talk about like archiving, I immediately talked about Radiophrenia, because yes, indeed, I was also talking with Mark Vernon, who is the organizer and curator of Radiophrenia, and indeed, like they had like 2 weeks of festival, but they are not considering like the archival part of all of it. But at least I think in my view, this is really something that makes the difference of our web radios, because it really allows like also to re-listen everything on demand. So of course, like it becomes like more similar probably to other web streaming platforms, but I think it's also one of the strength point of having like a website that at least in my view can be both, yes, it's becomes like both as a web radios and as a streaming platform, so that it is possible to, yes, to re-listen to everything. And I think it really makes the difference, or let's say it's like somehow the development of analog platforms, let's say of analog broadcasting. Because indeed, like on FM, we know it's not possible to re-listen to the episodes, to the archive, whatever. But this is what I'm trying to, I don't know, to push a bit, probably the boundaries of what is a web radio. At least in my view, it's also like important to probably to have space and to archive everything, also to give the possibility to the community, you know, to re-listen, and also somehow also, I don't know, to have a kind of portfolio also to what they have been doing, which is not that common probably. I don't know, it's really becoming like something that is independent and autonomous, so your work, it's there, it's uploaded there. It's not on Bandcamp, it's not on SoundCloud. So it becomes really like independent in a certain way.
Have you ever come across any resistance to that in terms of, because I think about the kind of freedom of transmitting or performing or any of these modes that are of the moment and then just gone. And if you know that it's been documented, if you know that it can be listened to on demand or watched again or whatever, there's a very different sense.
Yeah, I mean, of course, like every time before to archiving, let's say, the episodes, the shows, whatever, we ask the permission, of course. And yes, just like a few times it happens that some of the artists say like, okay, I prefer to not to have my works archived there, but mainly just because probably it was like still a work in progress. So yeah, they simply, they say no. So of course we are respecting the choices of there. It's not something that we are pretending. Of course, it's not that if people, if they don't want to archive their music, of course we are not saying, no, okay, then we don't broadcast your show. Yes, of course, it will be still part of the web radios, but then just not being part of the archive. So yes, of course, we also have some of the artists that are not archived, let's say, on the web radio. Yeah.
I'm very curious to hear your perspective, Kate, on this, because I also thought about, we talk about digital archive as if it was completely some sort of like, I don't know, evaporative, some sort of very abstract thing, but where in fact there are servers, there's a digital footprint of that, they're stored somewhere. There's also all sorts of different questions regarding both, from like safety to, sort of carbon footprint of the use of certain and not other, and like, are we not just creating a wasteland of content digitally? I was wondering what your take on that is, on archiving digitally everything.
I don't have a definitive answer, but I have all the same questions that you brought up. And I think in the sort of larger question of the archive, outside of whether to archive radio, there are all these issues that come up in terms of ethics and what gets stored and what doesn't get stored and how it gets categorized and all of this sort of thing. So I guess I think a little bit in that way as well. But in terms of my practice, I think I'm much more interested in the live temporality. So sometimes things are recorded, sometimes things are supposed to be recorded, but it doesn't happen. Someone forgot to press record or whatever. There are many projects that are a memory, which is also fine for me. And I think for me there is something very different to knowing that you're listening communally, even if it's a pre-recorded piece. To know that you're listening at the same time as other people is quite different to listening on demand and knowing that it's you in your bubble. Yeah, so there would be my thoughts on that.
No, I was also thinking like about another aspect like of having web radios nowadays, because I'm thinking that like several projects, they're also including like the visual part of it. So let's say, yeah, it's actually like a video recording of what is happening, that at least in my view was something that I was not really considering at the very beginning, because of course like I envision radio as an acousmatic medium, and that's it. But I'm also reconsidering also this aspect, because as you, I mean,
But this is actually like Red Light Radio in Amsterdam had a huge role in that, and like boiler room kind of things, because I think we also highlight a lot of the artistic sort of radiophonic sort of sound art examples, but a lot of community radios people are using them as first stepping stone in their DJing careers or their music careers, so for them to have a video that they can send then to producers or bookers, etc., becomes like this kind of tool to really sort of, again, talking about accessibility and democratization, a way to sidestep, sort of paying DJ schools or paying money to get access to DJ decks and good video material. And at least because a lot of radios that I interview, they have this video thing, and because artists want that, they want to have like a portfolio, and they all reference Red Light Radio in Amsterdam that shut down a few years ago, right? Because that was their format.
And it becomes also like a kind of like visual archive, no? So still thinking about archive, probably that's why just like, yes.
And there's different performativity as well of radio, I think, if there's a camera in front of you.
Definitely, yeah.
I had a question because that's something that I'm extremely interested in, and I picked up your use of agora as a metaphor, so I wanted to ask you what you mean by that and why that. And then the historical example you were using about the radio in the kitchen in Galway. Because I once, with Matteo actually, we were talking that we think about radio somewhere in between a public square and a library, because it's kind of like you can access and you have the space where you work on your own thing, but there's also this idea of public space where, opinions that you might not necessarily sort of, you get these conflicts of opinion, or there's idea of public space. So I was kind of picking up on these things, and I love the idea of kitchen, because kitchen is always the space of those conversations that happen in the kitchen are always the most sort of honest, and they show a certain level of intimacy. But yeah, so can you maybe talk a little bit about agora and why?
Yes. I mean, I mentioned it like in the context of envisioning radio, and it is a social and public space for artistic engagement. Because indeed, I really think about radio as a meeting place, no? As a meeting spot where exchange can happen, and especially still thinking about what is a community radio. At least in my view, it's happening. The development of a real community is happening in a real moment. I mean, when people can gather together, and again, for example, the Kashmir Radio Studio, to me, is really probably one of the best examples of community radio. And the community is building up because they have a studio which is open to the community and to the audience. So I think these really foster an artistic exchange, no? And possible collaboration and whatever. So yeah, in that sense, I'm envisioning, yes, this agora, acoustic agora, in that sense.
So I was also thinking about Chantal Mouffe and this idea of agonistic citizenship and forum, and this kind of almost this Greek idea of this idea of democracy as again happening. And so anyway, but I was wondering if that's something you were considering or not. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, no, it's a kind of quite new terms which that just comes up in my research. So, but of course, it's something that I want to explore more, because I think it resonates with several concepts that are very meaningful when thinking about community radios. Yeah.
Actually, Margherita Darcy, she often connects access to the airwaves with access to knowledge. So she used this metaphor as well. Just like we're able to go into a library and access books, we should be able to go onto the airwaves. And she also said that radio making is like cooking, which I really like that metaphor. I mean, in connection to theatre, she said, you know, for theatre you don't need anything, you can just do it. For radio you need the technology, so it's like cooking the food.
I absolutely love that. And also reminds me, because again, coming back to Kashmir, we're not just like, everything kind of comes back to Kashmir, but they used to have a breakfast show, or actually Independent Community Radio Network, we had a breakfast show, collaborative breakfast show, where each radio, every weekday, I think it was going for like 4 weeks, so it would be traveling for every day. It would be a different radio studio, and the breakfast show was people making breakfast in the local studio and broadcasting it live. And because it was across different locations, and you know, people have different breakfast rituals, it was also like it was a wonderful show. I love it. It's my favorite format is the breakfast shows, but where people actually are making and having breakfast together on air. So I really feel like this kitchen and food and this conviviality around communal eating and communal food making, and you know, all of these questions that open up with that are just absolutely brilliant.
Sorry.
Oh, yeah, there's audience.
Because I don't want to interrupt, but I thought it was a good moment perhaps to open up, if you agree, to maybe questions or input that might come from this side, and we can make it this bigger circle. Well, I know I have, but Caroline will go first.
Great, thank you so much. Just learning a lot from all of you. I just had a question, because Margherita, your presentation spoke also about technology, and yeah, I think also there are provocations from all presentations. I just wondered, I'm aware that like some of the participants in the network that you've been talking about, Ieva, are playing a lot with also mobile radio, or thinking also about the kitchen, but other spaces where really that you bring radio transmission technology also really to communities, or you think of ways with mobile phones that people who maybe are less familiar with radio are able to engage through mobile phone technologies as a more kind of community engaged practice. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about this kind of technology question and like flexibility around technology. We've also had a beautiful demonstration, Kate, in your presentation this evening. So I'd just love to hear how you're each thinking about the question of kind of playful engagement with technological possibilities.
Yes, thanks for the question. At least in my research, everything started thinking about the transition from analog to digital platforms, because we can see that nowadays, let's say, all the FM radio station, they switched also to digital platforms. So yes, of course, we can see this transition. And indeed, I'm exploring which are the differences of broadcasting on FM, for example, or on a web radios, or again, digital platforms. So also what it means, for example, to be streaming on platforms as YouTube, because it's also a way of streaming a content, no? So yeah, I'm trying to understand which are the differences of broadcasting or webcasting on all these different platform, and also how to address, let's say, my composition when I'm thinking about composing for an FM broadcast or web radios. So yes, and also another aspect is the interactivity. It's something that I'm trying to explore. So how web radios can, how we can explore the concept of interactiveness within the web radios landscape, because I think that somehow it's opening up a possibility to interact more with the audience. So let's say composer and audience, or audience and audience. So there is a way to create like a different communication and connection than compared to web radios, to FM radios. And I'm not sure yet what is this possibility for interactivities, but it's something that, yes, I want to explore more, let's say, while thinking about the technological aspect of it. Yes.
Well, to go hardcore analog. Well, micro FM transmitters are actually very, very easy to build, and it's the same with crystal radio receivers. So in terms of, you know, the access to the skills to make radio, that's it's actually very simple. Also in terms of cost. So with radio, otherwise, that's one of the things that we do. We develop and build micro FM transmitters with people. Another thing in terms of interactivity, it's actually it's one of my favorite ways of making radio, which you probably wouldn't call it making radio, but it's just using tons and tons of walkie-talkies because it automatically gets rid of this idea of one voice to many listeners. And you know, you can try and undo that in as many ways as you can, but there is still, and that's what I tried to talk about in my presentation, you know, how can you bring listening, how can you transmit listening and be more considerate of what you're transmitting rather than just sending out. But with walkie-talkies, there's a real democratization then, and there's real methods of interruption. If you don't like what someone's saying, you have to wait for your space. You have to be patient. It's a very, very. I mean, obviously, it's a small range, but I think it's a very interesting exercise in radio, collective radio.
For me, I mean, I didn't talk about it here, but in my research, technology and infrastructure, electricity grid comes in very interestingly, as the radio stations, for example, Hazdolin Radio in Kyiv, what did they do during blackouts in winter? So that was the last winter where there were like heavy shellings on the Ukrainian energy infrastructure. And the radio stations would have, I think they said that it's only one generator is enough to power like 2 studios. And they would just sit in through those blackouts and just like listen to music because, I mean, what better thing can you do? So I think it's kind of interesting that it comes, you know, like radio comes as this technology that actually is still cheap and easy, even in like, you know, when you don't have stable electricity. And the interesting thing that now people are starting, so one of the radios now released a first, they're turning into label, and they released a first blackout tapes, a cassette, where they invited all electronic musicians in the scene, create tracks using just analog technique, but they were electronic musicians sort of training. And I think that's also quite interesting because that idea came from the fact that people couldn't work on their usual electronic music instruments during blackouts, so they kind of started turning back to the analog technology, and cassettes were one of the things that they were able to listen that they would have at home during those blackouts. So that was kind of interesting on how like the aesthetics of, you know, if we have like sort of historical acoustic instruments informing how the like digital music making has happened, and then you have digital musicians kind of going to an analog because of circumstances, and how that just creates a different kind of aesthetics as well, just like from sort of compositional perspective. So technology for me is that infrastructure, civic infrastructure in a very sort of, in that sense.
I have a question. Maybe builds up, since Caroline introduced the question of technology, but I want to open up 2 things that hopefully, or what I'm seeing is that goes into this recurring question still of what is the community that you're talking about, or we are talking about, and Ieva, as you said, that is something to still make sense. So I thought that was interesting as an ongoing question. The main focal point is how, when we're talking about radio, we're talking about a historical medium, something that, as Margherita said, I mean, it's quite old, let's say, compared to a lot of things that we have. So we involved a certain development, historical, of different uses. But how is it that we think of it nowadays, after a lot of transformations and things that are more part of our reality, of everyday reality, having to do with the fact of how we have computers in our pockets all the time, and how we deal with them in terms of social media and communication? How many things that had to do with those maybe historical claims of radio are already permanent through our use of social media? The 2 things are coming to mind is at some point, I think, Ieva, you talked about the sonic imagination of being together, so how that has been modulated by, again, by the way that social media networks through the internet, etc., have created this imagination of being together in a particular way through how they work. And also I found it very interesting, Kate, when you brought this aspect also about not being seen, also not through a kind of trope of the acousmatic, which we could also question ourselves, is it useful to still consider, and what does the term acousmatic mean? But you said it, I think, opened up another perspective, which is the utility of not being seen, what that allows, which is also something that comes up a lot in social media and internet culture, this whole thing about not being seen and being creating this image and participating in a kind of obscurity of the possibility to express themselves, and we know a lot about that. So, I mean, having these kind of things that have really changed our perspective, right? I mean, how is the social network built? How do we rethink about radio, or what is it that is being particular about this community building that you're exploring? How is it redefined after these transformations that, in a way, internet culture and social media have created? I'm wondering if it's clear.
Yes, I mean, I will try to answer to the question, yes. At least, yes. As I mentioned also before during the presentation, I mean, I've also done like a quite in-depth research into the history and theory and the development of radio from the very beginning till the contemporary media landscape. And I can say that I can see the web radios as a kind of development of the pirate radio movement, which was developed, let's say, during the 60s, the 70s. Because again, also talking a bit about the technology and the accessibility of web radios. As I mentioned before, they are decentralizing and also democratizing the production and distribution of sound artwork also in itself, because there is also this shift from mainstream radio stations. So also exactly like we had like the development of FM radio station, which was always manipulated, let's say, under state control. So until the development of pirate movement radio stations. And then I would say that thanks to the development of the web radios, radio has somehow renewed itself. Well, of course, there are different approaches to FM radios, to making radio art nowadays with FM frequencies. But at the same time, also still talking about the technology, like having the accessibility to a radio server and building up your web radios nowadays, it's quite easy, accessible. Also, economically speaking, it's not that complicated. So. Yes, in that sense, it creates like really like a freedom, more freedom probably of expression. If I'm answering to the question somehow.
But can I like challenge that a little bit? Because I mean, you know, yes, the radio sort of started as a propaganda tool, but we also have this history of amateur thinkers of radio, right? From the very, very beginning. I mean, Karen Bursell, he wrote a book that also talks about QSL cards and, you know, like love for radio from the very beginning, and you know, engineers like across the world and in the peripheries of empire were very fascinated with this in technology as it appeared. So I always thought that, you know, that's for me fascinating about radio, because you have this radio that is the sort of centralizing power tool, but there's always these histories of like disrupting that and kind of reclaiming the control. And I feel like it's as embedded in that technology as is the potential for the propaganda, you know, which I find it's so challenging in a sense that I agree with you, but just like having another moment. But I agree. I mean, this question, I think in general, for me, it's this, you know, kind of rephrasing Jonathan Stern is like, why this technology still, if he asks why this technology now, so like why radio is still something people choose. And I like to think about radio as a shape sometimes that people sort of form their radio phonic or sonic practices in. And I think, I mean, one of my thoughts is that there there is a strong romanticism to radio. I think there is a certain nostalgia of maybe our experiences. I don't know, like a lot of my interviews and I myself, there is a relationship to sort of childhood and listening to radio. And people talk about listening to radio in their grandparents' flats, for example. So there's like almost like a personal. So maybe there is something about intimacy of not being seen that maintains that that romanticism. I don't know, Kate, maybe you disagree. Why I said that you? I don't know why, just because I wanted to pass on the question to you.
No, I think I would pass it back. I don't think it all got too complicated. I don't know where to answer.
I mean, I thought they were very interesting. Just a sec. Very interesting openings, following what you said. I mean, about exactly that the radio is not just about the technical device, but it's about this not being seen and this intimacy being created through a kind of network of practices. So, my question, I will go past the microphone, but just to maybe throw it in the table, if we continue discussing it a little bit, is. I'm curious on this building of a community, what are the tools to build that community? What are the variables that go beyond the devices and the procedures? So how does that become something unique, and how does it differentiate deeper from, again, this kind of internet cultural social network system that creates other forms of interaction? Yeah, in that sense, just to clarify maybe. But I will pass the microphone, so we continue.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for the presentation. My question goes a little bit around the situation of listening through headphones, because despite the fact that we have a bunch of devices here, nowadays most of the people are listening through headphones, and that's a completely different situation. For starters, concerning the community aspect, there's an individualization of it. There is noise cancelling of the environment. Another aspect also concerning production, for example, because while in the past you had a more narrow band of frequencies that you could reproduce on the devices, you also had it mono. And if you consider the fact that, well, since the whole loudness war from the digital sort of revolution in music making, that everything got louder. And that also plays a part in listening to everything through your headphones without such a dynamic range. Well, all of that, if you have comments, but also on the context of live radio, if you have a performance, how does that also plays a part when people will be listening through headphones to a live performance? If there's a specific tweaking of compression, how do you deal with all of that on the context of headphones?
Well, maybe I can start saying that generally speaking, I think that the listeners, when are tuned into in radio generally speaking, of course, they are listening into everyday life situations. So I think it really, of course, it depends on the setting and the environment, in which they are listening. Because generally speaking, it can happen from your kitchen while you are indeed having breakfast or whatever. So generally, I think that there is more a listening situation. That it depends. It's not necessarily happening with headphones. Of course, it's happening more and more nowadays while people let's say, are outdoor, probably more than indoor. So I think maybe first you can think about this differentiation. And plus what we are thinking, if you say also, yes, indeed, broadcasting mono or not, at least in my view, there is a particular attention while broadcasting or webcasting live events, as we've done during On Air On Site with different microphone techniques. So I'm trying really to deliver, the best audio quality setup situation, really giving also sense of of the ambience of the room using a dynamic room microphone stories or different microphones which are mixed together to create an output that can be listen, yes, in different contexts set up, both with the headphones or not, because of course you can't predict how the listener are tuning in or listening, It can be like, yes, a traffic noise or at home or headphones. So, yeah, I don't know. These are just some consideration while thinking about, the listening setup, a listening environment. I don't know if you have any comments on that.
From my experience, it depends a lot on the technician and how geeky the technician is, because for myself, I am quite minimal, so I wouldn't be thinking about which frequencies are available and which should be used. So I think it really it depends on the person, and I find it very interesting to see how different people handle it in different ways. And for me, actually, one of the things that I really like to think about with radio is the idea that people are listening in a different space, especially with live radio. So you have this kind of layered listening of listening to the sound of a space and a moment that's happening through the radio together with your own environment. I find that very interesting. But like you say, you have absolutely no control about how people listen unless you set up a kind of installation setting. So I think it's not worth trying to control it that hard.
Your question made me think about another very, I think, common way of listening to the radio, which is in the car, which is yet another sort of space that is also kind of private, kind of public. You're there, you can, you can open your window if you really want to, share it with the neighborhood, or you can close it. And I often think about, again, one of those settings, right? We're talking about these kind of settings in which radio happens. And I'm thinking about, headphones and commute. This is kind of, this idea of you have a soundtrack for the start of your day, and there's this notion of mood, which I think is very interesting in terms of when we think about genre or how we code our listening, this idea of mood. And I mean, NTS, the most, I guess, sort of popular community radio from London, they have, instead of having genre classifications, they have these very obscure, there's beach, chill out, world, they seem arbitrary, but actually for a listener, or for a regular listener, if you see beach, you will know what kind of vibe you get from that. And I think that almost unwritten implied contract between a radio programmer of saying if it's a morning, it's probably not going to be a live recording of Noise Show, right? It's probably going to be something that's easy to listen on headphones. And then, if it's a live festival, it's likely that a listener who's informed with your content is not going to listen on the headphones or with a very good headphones, right? Because the idea will be to set yourself up for an experience, right? Of for example, on Air Inside, I'm sure that, people kind of got ready to listen to, or feel the event in their own settings wherever they listen. So I feel there is this, I think it's very interesting to think about this interface as it's not an inter-ear, as a contract between the radio and the listener, and kind of almost predictor or how that listening is going to happen. So I don't know. I think the listening in the car is very interesting as also radio moment in radio history, or radio ontology.
I'm not sure if you want to finish or. My question is kind of related to the previous one, though going in a very different direction. I would like to pose let's call it an eco-ethical question. You talked about democratization of allowing voices that are not heard regularly to speak. And I also remember the term that you used, the geopoetics. I would maybe think more of an aeropoetics. And I actually came to the question during the presentation of Kate, because there was this, the cracking of the medium. And I was wondering how much you allow those things to happen, and to give a space for those sounds that actually are usually excluded. So these sounds that are not made by humans, or not necessarily made by humans, but are an intrinsic element perhaps of radio art, at least FM and AM, maybe not so much web radio, but then we come, of course, to the idea of Jonathan Stern, like how much do we progress in making it as clean as possible, which of course it's a matter of time before we think, oh, is that what we thought? That was like an absolute perfect transmission. But anyway, I was interested in, is there a space for these things to happen which are actually coming from non-human, I would call it interventions or resonances, or as a part of your radio shows?
I feel it's a question for you, Kate.
Oh, I understood it was in reference, but maybe to you. I think it's a very good question in terms of a sterile studio, and in general, you know, whether to let sounds in. And I think I've always found, because I've done radio quite a lot in public spaces, and I've never tried to block out the sound. You know, lots of people would say, this is a terrible place to do radio because you can hear people in the bar. There's this chute here that every time someone upstairs flushes, you hear this sound. But I think it's just, it shares the site and the moment. With radio otherwise, I think what we tried to do is open out to those things that we might not things that we might not expect. That's kind of the point, to try and tune into different media, like the water, the air, different vibrational things, and hope that there would be some things that filter in that we are not expecting. That's kind of the point of that project.
Yes, I mean, I can say something that somehow resonated, but since I'm not really working with generally with FM, so there is always something that is somehow that we can control while thinking about webcasting. But still, I think that the act of being live, of doing like live radio, and again also the fact that is the unpredictability of the listener situation is always something that we have to accept as a radio maker, even when I'm thinking more about my really like a compositional practice. So yes, you have to consider that the perception of the how to say, yes, the experience, it's always like mixed with the other sounds of the everyday life. So this is something that is really, I think, one of the main characteristics of doing radio, listening to radio. So yes, somehow there is also something that we can't really control and we can't predict, and it's part of it, I think.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that my idea about this question is that I think the kind of radio that we were describing allows that to happen. Whether it happens is a choice of sometimes the radio maker, because from some of the radios that I work with, or like I listen to, or like I research, for example, soundscapes is something that's becoming very, interesting. I don't, it's always been a thing, right? But kind of having a radio show that is a soundscape, or having some sort of artistic like some sort of artistic intervention and play with the recordings, and what kind of, again, because a lot of my work is in Ukraine, people think about either it's sort of air raid sirens, but also soundscape as a kind of evidence of like the toll on the ecologies, on the nature of war. So, sort of these kind of questions, they come in sometimes as an artistic choice, which is slightly different from what you're asking. But I think nevertheless it kind of speaks that the radio, I think the radios that we're talking about, at least it gives me a sense that the listener would not expect there to be a less anthropocentric perspective of radio. I think it kind of allows that idea in its, I don't know. Because I still feel like it's I'm interested in what you think, because I feel like it is, of course, a political question and it is an ecological question, but often I think it's also an aesthetical question for a radio maker. And I think our radios kind of encourage those aesthetics, and then I guess sometimes it happens, sometimes it's more synthetic, let's say, I don't know.
But I think it's also a technological question, because you have to, if you have a closed mic, then you're not going to get some, I don't know, the sound of the dawn chorus or the dusk chorus or something coming in.
Well, but you know what I mean, like that person should, like, this is something that I think, it's a choice, right? So, anyway.
It's been a great evening with a lot of input. I think we're ready to wrap up. Thanks a lot for your presentation. Thanks for showing all your work. Thanks everyone here for being and attending and participating. As I said, well, this is the last one of the year, but we will continue with In the Making and all the making that is pending to be done. Good evening. Thanks for joining. Yeah.